Chapter 14. Child of Shadows. Sunny had no choice but to resort to one last, desperate gamble. He had no chance against the enemy in a direct confrontation, at least not without an advantage. Bloodbane poison was supposed to be his hidden card, but turned out to be nearly useless. Being able to see in the dark did not help that much, too. Somehow, Hero was able to perceive their surroundings even without any light. Whether he was using his sense of hearing or some magical ability, Sunny did not know, not that it mattered now that they had left the cave and were standing under the moonlit sky. Now he had only one advantage left. The fact that he knew that the tyrant was blind, and Hero did not. Acting on that knowledge, however, was easier said than done. But what else could he do? That's why he tried to stay as quiet as possible and rang the silver bell. If the description did not lie, its ringing could be heard from miles away. Surely, the tyrant was going to hear it, too. Now Sunny only had to stay silent, stall for time and hope that the monster would come. As he did so, Hero's bewilderment slowly turned into anger. "Tell me right now or you will regret it." His voice was quite threatening, but still, the young slave did not answer. He just shivered in the cold and tried not to groan despite the pulsing pain in his chest. "Why are you not answering?" But Sunny did not dare to answer. He held his breath and watched, horrified, as the familiar colossal figure appeared behind Hero. His lungs were on fire, and his heart was beating like crazy. It was beating so loud that he was even afraid that the blind tyrant would hear it. But, of course, it couldn't be louder than Hero's voice, who was still talking, turning himself into the only source of noise on this mountain. At the last second, a hint of understanding appeared in the young soldier's eyes. He began to turn around, his sword rising with lightning speed. But it was too late. A massive hand appeared from the darkness and caught him into an iron grip. The bone claws scraped against the armor, pulling it apart. Mountain King dragged Hero back, paying little attention to the sword biting into its wrist. Viscous saliva was streaming from its opened maw. Petrified by fear, Sunny slowly turned his back to them and took a couple of steps up the old, winding path. Then he darted away, running as fast as he could. Behind him, a desperate scream tore apart the silent night. Then a hungry roar followed. It seemed that Hero wasn't going down without a fight, even though his fate was already sealed. But Sunny didn't care. He was running away, climbing higher and higher. "I'm sorry, Hero," he thought. "I did say that I will watch you die, but, as you know, I am a liar. So go and die on your own." A lonesome dark mountain stood tall against the raging winds. Jagged and proud, it dwarfed other peaks of the mountain chain, cutting the night sky with its sharp edges. A radiant moon bathed its slopes in the ghostly light. Under that light, a young man with pale skin and black hair reached the peak of the mountain. However, his looks didn't match the magnificence of the scene. Wounded and staggering, he looked pathetic and weak. The young man looked like a walking corpse. His coarse tunic and cloak were torn and smeared with blood. His sunken eyes were cloudy and lifeless. His body was bruised, beaten and cut. There were specks of bloody foam on his lips. He was hunched over, cradling the left side of his chest. Each step caused him to moan, ragged breath barely escaping through gritted teeth. Sunny was hurting all over. But most of all, he was cold. So cold. He just wanted to lie down in the snow and fall asleep. But instead, he continued walking. Because he believed that the nightmare will be over once he reaches the peak. Step. Another step. Finally, he had made it. At the highest point of the mountain, a vast expanse of flat rock was covered with snow. In the center of it, illuminated by moonlight, stood a magnificent temple. Its colossal columns and walls were cut from black marble, with exquisite reliefs decorating the Stygian pediment and broad frieze. Beautiful and awesome, it looked like a palace of a dark god. At least it did once. Now, the temple was in ruins, fractures and cracks marred the black stones, parts of the roof had collapsed, letting in ice and snow. Its tall gates were broken, as if smashed into pieces by a hand of a giant. Still, Sunny was satisfied. "Found you," he said in a hoarse voice. Gathering the last of his strength, the young slave slowly limped in the direction of the ruined temple. His thoughts were muddled and confused. "See this, hero," he thought, forgetting for a second that Hero was already dead. "I've made it. You were strong and ruthless, and I was weak and timid. Yet now you are a corpse, and I am still alive. Isn't it funny?" He stumbled and groaned, feeling the edges of his broken ribs cutting deeper into his lungs. Blood was dripping from his mouth. Dead or not, Hero had gotten him good with that single strike. Actually, it's not. What do any of you even know about being ruthless? Poor fools. In the world where I come from, people had thousands of years to turn cruelty into an art. And as someone on the receiving end of all that cruelty, don't you think I would know more about being vicious than you ever could? He was getting closer to the temple. Truth be told, you never stood a chance. Wait, what was I thinking about? A moment later, he had already forgotten. There was only pain, the dark temple, and the overpowering desire to sleep. Don't fall for it. It's just hypothermia. If you fall asleep, you'll die. Finally, Sunny reached the steps of the Black Temple. He started to climb them, not noticing thousands of bones that were scattered around. These bones once belonged to humans and monsters both. All of them were killed by the invisible guardians still lingering around the temple. As Sunny was climbing the steps, one of the shapeless guardians approached him. It was ready to snuff out the spark of life that was burning weakly in the defiler's chest, but then stopped, sensing a faint, strangely familiar scent coming from his soul. The scent of divinity. Sorrowful and lonesome, the guardian moved aside, letting Sunny pass. Oblivious, he entered the temple. Sunny found himself in a grandiose hall. Cascades of moonlight were falling through the holes in the partially collapsed roof. Deep shadows were surrounding these circles of silver light, not daring to touch them. The floor was covered in snow and ice. At the far end of the hall, a large altar was cut from a single piece of black marble. It was the only thing inside the temple untouched by snow. Forgetting why he came here, Sunny headed for the altar. He just wanted to sleep. The altar was dry, clean, and as wide as a bed. Sunny climbed on it and lay down. It seemed like he was going to die. He was okay with it. Sunny tried to close his eyes, but was stopped by a sudden noise coming from the direction of the temple's entrance. He turned his head to look, not even a little bit curious. What he saw would have sent chills running down his spine if he wasn't so cold, tired, and indifferent. Mountain King was standing there, looking at him with its 5 blind eyes. He was still massive, terrifying and revolting. Worm-like shapes were still moving frantically under its skin. It was sniffing the air, salivating. Then it opened its maw and moved forward, slowly approaching the altar. What an ugly bastard, Sunny thought, and suddenly clutched his chest, convulsing in a fit of torturous coughing. Bloody foam flew from his mouth and fell on the altar. However, the black marble soon absorbed it. A second later, it was as pristine as it was before. The tyrant was just about to reach Sunny. It was already stretching its hands to grab him. I guess this is the end, he thought, resigned to his fate. But at the last second, suddenly, the voice of the spell resounded in the dark temple. You have offered yourself as a sacrifice to the gods. The gods are dead, and cannot hear you. Your soul bears the mark of divinity. You are a temple slave. Shadow God stirs in his eternal slumber. He sends a blessing from beyond the grave. Child of shadows, receive your blessing. Under Sunny's astonished eyes, the shadows crowding the great hall suddenly moved, as though coming alive. Tentacles of darkness surged forward, entangling Mountain King's arms and legs. The mighty tyrant struggled, trying to get free. But how could it resist the power of a god? The shadows dragged Mountain King back, pulling in different directions. The tyrant opened its maw, and a furious howl escaped it. The next second, its body ruptured, torn apart into pieces. Blood, viscera and severed limbs fell on the floor in a crimson torrent. Just like that, the horrible creature was dead. Sunny blinked. Once again, he was alone in the ruined temple. The great hall was dark and silent. And then the spell whispered. "You have slain an awakened tyrant, Mountain King. Wake up, Sunless. Your nightmare is over. Prepare for appraisal." Chapter 15. Shadow Slave. Prepare for appraisal. Sunny found himself in a space between dream and reality. It was an endless black void illuminated by a myriad of stars. Between those stars, countless strings of silver light were woven into a beautiful and inconceivably complex net, forming various nexuses and constellations. It was truly breathtaking. Somehow, Sunny understood that he was seeing the inner workings of the nightmare spell. He also couldn't help but think that it looked a lot like the celestial equivalent of a neural network. If so, was the spell alive? This was a question that countless people had been asking themselves for the past few decades. The best answer they had come up with was that there was no way to know. The spell was neither alive nor dead, neither sentient nor mindless. It was more of a function than a creature. But Sunny was in no mood to ponder philosophical questions. He was eagerly awaiting his boon. The spell was still appraising his performance. However, the first reward had nothing to do with it. "You have received a memory, Puppeteer's Shroud." Yes. Sunny felt incredibly elated. He was almost ready to do a happy dance. That memory belonged to Mountain King, who was an awakened tyrant, which meant that the memory itself was of the awakened rank. Getting it was a stroke of incredible luck. There were 7 ranks to everything in the spell. These ranks were, in order of growing power, dormant, awakened, ascended, transcendent, supreme, sacred and divine, with the exclusion of nightmare creatures, who were ranked as dormant, awakened, fallen, corrupted, great, cursed and unholy. From the spell's point of view, Sunny was a dormant human. Having a memory of a higher rank than his own soul core would be of great help once he enters the dream realm. The power gap between different ranks simply could not be overestimated. He wanted to take a look at the Puppeteer's Shroud, but there was no more time. The spell was done with its appraisal. Here in the void, its voice didn't sound subtle and familiar anymore. Rather, it seemed like the universe itself was speaking. Sunny held his breath, listening. "Aspirant. Your trial is over." A nameless slave ascended the Black Mountain. Both heroes and monsters fell by his hand. Unbroken, he entered the ruined temple of a long-forgotten god and spilled his blood on the sacred altar. The gods were dead, and yet they listened. "You have defeated a dormant beast, Mountain King's larva. You have defeated 3 dormant humans, names unknown. You have defeated an awakened human, Oro of the 9. You have defeated an awakened tyrant, Mountain King. You have received the Shadow God's blessing. You have achieved the impossible. Final appraisal, glorious. Your treachery truly knows no bounds." That final part was not really necessary, as far as Sunny was concerned, but he was still pretty satisfied with the praise from the spell. He felt like his chances of evolving his aspect to an awakened, or even ascended one were pretty high. His overall power was still dependent on the rank of his soul core, which would remain dormant until much later, but the rank of the aspect itself would do wonders for his overall potential. "Dreamer Sunless, receive your boon." He was an aspirant no more. Sunny grinned. "You have been bestowed a true name, lost from light." His jaw dropped. A true name. He had received a true name. Never in his wildest dreams did Sunny dream of becoming one of the chosen few to accomplish such feat, and in his very first nightmare to boot. Not even all of the saints could boast of having one. He was an elite now, a bona fide cream of the crop. He was going to be rich. But the rewards kept coming. Your aspect is ready to evolve. Evolve aspect? What kind of a question is that? Sunny crossed his fingers and said, yes. Dormant aspect temple slave is evolving. New aspect acquired. Aspect rank, divine. Sunny fell over. Aspect name, shadow slave. Divine, it's divine. Sunny was standing on his knees, stupefied. The shock was so great that for a second there he lost all control over his limbs and fell. It said, divine, right? He raised a trembling hand and rubbed his eyes, making sure that he was awake. Or rather conscious, since, technically, he was still sleeping in the underground vault of the police station. Confused by all this terminology, Sunny silently summoned the runes and found the lines describing his aspect. Aspect, shadow slave. Aspect rank, divine. Aspect description, you are a miraculous shadow left behind by a dead god. As a divine shadow, you possess plenty of strange and wondrous powers. However, your existence is empty and lonesome. You mourn the passing of your former master and long to find a new one. Innate ability, shadow bond. Ability description, find a worthy master and let them know your true name. Once they recite it out loud, you will be bound to their will, unable to disobey any command. It is improper for a shadow, let alone a divine one, to walk around without a master. That was a lot to digest. First of all, Sunny felt his heart beating faster. He heard it right. All the suffering and horror he had experienced in the first nightmare paid off in the end. A divine aspect, he had received a divine aspect. Anything above awakened was rare and immensely valuable. People with ascended aspects were rare enough to be fought over by various factions. The factions themselves were built around singular powerhouses with transcendent or supreme aspects. And he had never, ever heard of anyone acquiring a divine one. Never. Anything with the divine prefix was so hard to find that it mostly lived in the realm of myths and legends. After all, the human race had not reached that high yet. It was only slightly more than a decade since humans managed to finally conquer the third nightmare and receive the ability to evolve their cores to transcendent rank. As transcendents, or saints, as they were called in the real world, powerful awakened ruled over the dream realm, but even they did not dare to face nightmare creatures of higher ranks. Subsequently, there were not a lot of memories and echoes of supreme rank around, let alone sacred, or divine. The same went for aspects. And yet Sunny just got one. He grinned, driven half-mad by joy and arrogance. However, his jubilation was a little muddied. After all, there was that weird innate ability. Of course, he had no intention of becoming someone's magical slave, with no free will of his own. To hell with that. But it wasn't that bad. All he had to do to avoid that fate was to conceal his true name. No one except for him could see his status. That meant that Sunny just had to keep his mouth shut, and no one will know that he even had one. It meant giving up on all the benefits that someone who was bestowed a true name after the first nightmare was entitled to, but it all paled in comparison with a divine aspect. Not a problem, Sunny thought with a smirk. If the spell had the ability to laugh, it would surely do so after hearing his thoughts. However, it didn't. Instead, it began to speak again. The first seal is broken. Awakening Dormant Powers. Chapter 16. Rebirth. Sunny felt something waking up inside of him. With a startled cry, he clutched his chest and stared into the darkness, trying to understand what was happening. The feeling was not painful or unpleasant, yet it was like nothing he had ever experienced. It was as though his soul was being shaken awake, infused with strange new energy. However, that energy did not come from some outside source. Rather, it was coming from within, as though it had always been there, sleeping. The energy filled every fiber of his being. Sunny felt his emotions becoming clearer and sharper. Then, his body began to change, too. He felt as though a miniature star was burning in the center of his chest. Waves of heat were radiating from it, slowly reaching his stomach and shoulders, then his arms and legs, then his hands and feet. Under that heat, his bones, muscles, organs and blood vessels were being rebuilt and revitalized. Sunny felt like he was being reborn. He was becoming stronger, faster, healthier. It was euphoric. With each second, his transformation was becoming more profound. New confidence settled in Sunny's heart. He was not a weak, frail street kid anymore. He was not as vulnerable against anyone who would wish to bully him as he was in the past. With his powers awakened and his will tempered by the horrors of the first nightmare, he was now someone you would not want to cross. After some time had passed, the star burning in his chest finally cooled down. The heat was replaced with a soothing coldness. That coldness washed over Sunny's body, taking away all the aches and discomforts that had been accumulated there over the years. Then it moved up, reaching his brain and, finally, his eyes. His vision strangely doubled. He could still see the void populated by an endless pattern of stars. But he could also see something different. A silent, calm dark sea illuminated by a lonely black sun. From his previous knowledge, Sunny knew that this was his so-called Sea of Soul. But he also knew that it was supposed to look quite different. For starters, it was supposed to be much more lively. The star hanging above, the visual representation of his soul core, was supposed to be burning with bright light, filling the soul sea with a warm, blinding shining. However, Sunny's soul was dark and lightless. That's strange. He took a look at the black sun. At a closer examination, it actually turned out to be transparent. It's just that with no other major source of light around, the star appeared to be as dark as its surroundings. Also, no one was supposed to be here except for him. It was his soul, after all. But Sunny had a nagging feeling that somewhere just beyond the periphery of his vision, hidden in the darkness, shapeless forms were constantly moving. No matter how he turned his head, he couldn't catch a clear glimpse of them. And yet the feeling would not go away. Not wishing to waste any more time on this right now, Sunny turned back to the black sun and finally spotted two spheres of light orbiting around it, as though caught in the soul core's gravity well. A subtle smile appeared on his face. These were his memories, Silver Bell and Pupitur's shroud. Later, there would be dozens of such spheres here. If he was lucky, he would even acquire an echo or two. The spell's voice suddenly pulled him out of the sea of soul. Awakening aspect ability. This is it. The moment of truth, Sunny thought. Divine aspect or not, his immediate future still depended on the first aspect ability he would receive. His role in the dream realm would be based on its characteristics. If it was a combat ability, he would be most useful on the front lines of the bloody battles against the nightmare creatures. If it was tied to sorcery, he would likely become a powerful, but fragile ranged fighter. If it was something having to do with utility, he would be a vitally important part of the behind-the-scenes workings of the dream realm. Utility abilities were also extremely valued in the real world, where Awakened performed many tasks that kept it going. If he was lucky, he could even become a healer. Healers were very rare, and as such, sought-after specialists. Aspect ability acquired. Aspect ability name, Shadow Control. Sunny hurriedly summoned the runes. He wanted to go to the description of his new ability right away, but then decided to give his overall information a look first. Name, Sunless. True name, Lost from Light. Rank, Dreamer. Shadow Core, Dormant. Shadow Fragments, 12. What is that? Where the rank of his soul core was supposed to be written, a mysterious shadow core appeared instead. Sunny looked at it, blinking. He had never heard of anyone having a different kind of core before. Was he that unique? This enigmatic shadow core would certainly explain why his sea of soul looked so strange. And also, he moved his eyes down, noticing the shadow fragments counter. Usually, there was supposed to be an indicator of the number of soul shards consumed. However, it was nowhere to be seen. Do I actually have a completely different progression path than all awakened? The idea was as exciting as it was frightening. Not having to fight for resources with anybody else was an incredible advantage. Most of the human society in the dream realm was built around the acquisition of soul shards. If he had no need to gather them to evolve, not only would he be able to become more powerful with incredible speed, he would also be completely self-sufficient. On the other hand, he had no idea how to acquire these shadow fragments. However, he had gotten 12 of them somehow already, so whatever it was that he had to do, he had already done it in the first nightmare. I'll have to explore this carefully. Satisfied with this decision, Sunny continued to study the runes. Memories, Silver Bell, Puppeteer's Shroud. Attributes, Fated, Mark of Divinity, Child of Shadows. Aspect, Shadow Slave. Aspect rank, Divine. Aspect abilities, Shadow Control. Aspect ability description, your shadow is more independent than most. It is an invaluable helper. What is that supposed to mean? Sunny held his breath and began to read the description again, but at that moment, a new set of runes appeared just below it. Simultaneously, the spell's voice resounded in the black void. All power has a price. You have received a flaw. Sunny read the runes, and his eyes widened in horror. O-N-O-N-O-N-O-N-O, Chapter 17. 3 simple words. He closed his eyes, then opened them again, hoping that the runes would disappear. Please, be gone. Please. But the runes were still there, shining slightly, as though mocking him. Flaw, clear conscience. Flaw description, you cannot lie. Sunny stared at these 3 simple words, feeling like there was a bottomless abyss opening right beneath his feet. The spell, which was usually frivolous with its descriptions, decided to be straight and on point this time. There were only 3 words. They left him no room to maneuver. I can't lie. Me? How am I supposed to live if I can't lie? Sunny's very survival was predicated on his ability to deceive and outsmart other people. Even the spell itself congratulated him on his treachery. Without the ability to lie, he wouldn't be able to achieve anything. Not to mention, his heart suddenly felt as though it was about to stop. If he could only tell the truth, how was he supposed to hide his true name? Wouldn't anyone be able to turn him into an obedient slave by simply asking a couple of innocent questions? Sunny was about to scream and curse, but at that moment, the spell spoke again. Wake up, lost from light. The black void spun and disappeared. Sunny opened his eyes. The armored ceiling of the police station's vault hung above him. No one would call its aesthetics beautiful, but to him, it was the most majestic sight. Only now did he realize how much he had missed the real world. It was safe and familiar. There were no monsters or slavers, well, at least officially. There was no constant fear of torturous death. It was home. In addition, Sunny felt incredible. The cold that had crept deep into his bones during the nightmare was gone, taking with it all the pain that his wounded body had been enduring day after day. His feet and wrists were not in agony, his back had forgotten the bite of the whip, and he could even breathe without feeling the sharp edges of his broken ribs cutting deeper and deeper into his lungs. What a blessing! The sudden disappearance of pain, coupled with the new vitality that permeated his body, almost made Sunny cry. I really survived. He slowly looked down and then froze, breathless. On a cheap plastic chair placed beside his reinforced medical bed sat the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. She had short, raven black hair and icy blue eyes. Her flawless skin was smooth, supple and as white as snow. Actually, This was Sunny's first time meeting someone as pale as he himself was. However, while Sunny's pallor looked strange and unhealthy, the beautiful stranger was nothing short of striking. The woman seemed to be in her late 20s. She was wearing a dark blue uniform with silver epaulets and black leather boots. The jacket of her uniform was casually unbuttoned, revealing a black tank top beneath. Currently, she was stretching her arms above her head, clearly bored and sleepy. The gesture forced the thin fabric to tighten, provocatively accentuating her full breasts. Mesmerized, Sunny almost missed the fact that there was a shoulder insignia on the woman's left sleeve. There were 3 stars on it. 3 stars, he thought, distracted. 3 stars means an... Wait. An ascended? But before Sunny could fully digest the meaning of this word, he realized that the woman was staring at him, too. "What are you looking at?" she said, not a gram of humor in her voice. Sunny blinked a couple of times, embarrassed, and quickly came up with an excuse. Then he opened his mouth and answered. "Your breasts." A second later, his eye widened in absolute horror. Because he wasn't planning to say those words at all. His mouth moved on its own. A wave of terror suddenly drowned his mind. The woman slowly smiled with a dangerous gleam in her eyes. Then, without any warning, she moved her hand and slapped Sunny across the face. Sunny's whole body was turned around. If it wasn't for the restraints holding him in place, he would have probably flown off the bed. For a moment, he even saw stars. But it could still be considered getting off lightly. An ascended, the woman was an ascended. She could have torn his head clean off with a flick of a finger. Why did he have to offend someone so powerful, of all people? Meanwhile, the woman cleared her throat and crossed her arms. "Are you awake now?" Sunny held his numb cheek and carefully nodded. "Good. Let me give you a piece of advice, don't just say anything that comes to your mind. Especially to girls. It's not like you haven't seen a girl before, right? Say, thank you." "I definitely will not," Sunny thought. But instead, his mouth moved on its own, and he said, "I've seen plenty, but no one as beautiful as you." Then he flinched back, his face as red as a lobster. The woman stared at him for a few seconds and then burst into laughter. "I see you haven't met a lot of awakened then." "By awakened standards, I'm below average." Sunny glanced at her with doubt. The woman shook her head. "As your soul core develops, the body gets rid of all its imperfections. So it's hard to find an unattractive awakened, especially among the stronger ones. Live long enough, and you might just become a flower boy yourself." Then she gave him a thorough look and added, "Well, maybe. In any case, since you're awake, welcome back to the land of the living. Congratulations on surviving your first nightmare, Sleeper Sunless." Sleeper Sunless. That was how people would address him now, at least in the short span of days until the winter solstice. After that, he would either return from the dream realm as an awakened or not return at all. It felt strange to have a title put before his name. In the past, Sunny was rarely even addressed by name. People mostly called him things like boy, punk, brat, or hey, you. But now he even had a title. Sleeper Sunless. Actually, the correct term was dreamer. But humans had their own set of words for those infected by the nightmare spell. Carriers who had just finished their first nightmare were called sleepers because of how they interacted with the spell. Basically, once his spirit enters the spell, his body was going to fall into slumber. That slumber would continue for days, weeks, or even months, however long it takes him to escape the dream realm. Hence the term, sleeper. Once he escapes and becomes an awakened, he would live his life normally during the day and return to the dream realm every time he falls asleep. The awakened were called the same by the spell and the humans. That word was also sometimes used as a general term for all carriers. Then, if he were to decide to enter a second nightmare and manage to survive, he would become an ascended, people called them masters. Masters could enter and exit the dream realm as they wished. Some even chose to never come back there at all. More than that, they traveled between the worlds physically, not just in spirit. And then, above the masters, there were saints, those who had conquered the third nightmare and earned the right to call themselves transcendent. They were as powerful as demigods, and even more rare. Not only could they travel between the real world and the dream realm, but they could also take others with them. But coming back to masters. The beautiful woman stood up and approached the reinforced medical bed. With practiced moves, she began to undo the restraint holding Sunny in place. I am Ascended Jet. You can call me Master Jet. These past 3 days, I was on watch duty due to your nightmare. Right, before I fell asleep, the policeman told me that an awakened would arrive in a few hours to monitor my condition, to kill the nightmare creature if I die and let it through. Sunny was unwilling to open his mouth, terrified that all sorts of truths would come spilling out. But there were things he simply had to know. Master Jet? I have a question. Go on. Why would a master be put on watch duty? Isn't it below your pay grade? Jet gave him a dark look. You're smarter than you seem. Recently, there was a lot of gates opening in this sector. Most of the local awakened are either wounded or occupied with the cleanup. Or dead. It's always like that close to the winter solstice. She opened the final restraint and took a step back. Plus, there's not a lot of awakened who, like me, directly work for the government. It's by far the least lucrative or glorious career one of us can choose. Would you abandon wealth and fame to work abysmal hours and risk your life, fueled only by altruism and sense of duty? Sunny wanted to say something flattering. Instead, he looked Master Jet right in the eyes and smirked. Of course not. I'm not an idiot. Damn this damn flaw. Damn. She stared at him with a humorless expression. Sunny thought that he was going to get slapped again. But instead, Jet smiled. See, I was right. You really are smart. Chapter 18. Absence of light. Sunny was enjoying a hot shower. After their short conversation, Master Jet had sent him to clean himself, saying that he reeked of nightmare. The unnatural slumber of the spell would slow down the body's metabolism, and the medical apparatus he had been strapped into was supposed to take care of the rest, but he was still asleep for 3 whole days. Even if only psychological, the scent of bloodshed and despair lingered around him. Ah, I'm in heaven, Sunny thought, willing himself to temporarily forget about the looming disaster of the flaw. He was alone in the police station showers, relaxing under the streams of hot water. After a bit of time had passed, Sunny reluctantly turned the tap off and walked over to the towel rack. Coincidentally, he saw himself reflecting in the mirror. The changes in his physique were subtle, but noticeable. His pale skin seemed a little healthier, his muscles a bit more pronounced. He looked slender and lean instead of emaciated and frail, as he did before. There was a slight luster to his dark hair and a shine to his eyes. However, he was still rather diminutive. Not exactly a picture of masculine handsomeness, to say the least. Flower boy, huh? Sunny thought, full of bitterness. Then he suddenly froze, noticing something strange. As he was looking at himself in the mirror, the reflection of his shadow seemed to move. It was as though the shadow lowered its head and quietly face-bombed. Sunny quickly turned around, piercing his shadow with a nervous look. However, everything seemed normal. The shadow was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, repeating his every motion. I clearly saw you move, he said, feeling a bit strange. You have just moved on your own, right? Sunny glared at the shadow, which obediently glared back. Did you move or not? The shadow enthusiastically shook its head. What the? What do you mean, no? You've just moved your head. Do you think I'm a fool? The shadow seemed to think for a bit and then shrugged. Sunny was left with his mouth agape. Your shadow is more independent than most. It is an invaluable helper, he muttered finally. Right. This was how the spell had described his aspect ability. But what exactly could his shadow do? He decided to experiment a little. Hey, you. Tell me what you can do. The shadow was silent and motionless. Right. It doesn't have vocal cords. As though that made any sense. Shadows were not supposed to have muscles either, and yet it knew how to move. Show me. No reaction. It seems the shadow was content pretending to be an ordinary, lifeless blob of darkness. Sunny sighed. I'm doing this wrong. Independent or not, the shadow was still a part of him. It was a manifestation of his aspect ability. So instead of asking the shadow, he really should have been asking himself. Not going to talk, are you? Sunny closed his eyes and directed his perception within, exploring himself for the first time since returning to the real world. He felt the beating of his heart, the steady rising of his chest, the slight chill of the shower room. He heard droplets of water falling on the tiled floor. Felt the movement of filtered air against his skin. And there, on the verge of his consciousness, something new. A completely new sense. Sunny concentrated on it, and suddenly a whole other world opened to him. It was hard to describe with words, just like one would have trouble explaining how hearing or touch feels. It was as though he could communicate with vast forms that crowded around him and receive an understanding of both their own shape and the surrounding space, guided by the different degrees of pressure they exerted on his mind and each other. That understanding came naturally and instantaneously, like an instinct. These forms were shadows. And among them, one, not the largest one, but the deepest, didn't feel like an external entity. It was like a part of his soul. Once Sunny grasped the feeling of it, he could sense the shadow just like he sensed his limbs. The only thing was that his limbs were made out of flesh, and the shadow was made from the absence of light. Sunny opened his eyes and looked at the shadow. Then, with a thought, he willed it to raise an arm. The shadow raised an arm. He willed it to sit, stand, turn around, kick. Then he willed it to change shape, turning into a circle, then a line, then a monster. And finally, back to his own silhouette. The shadow was mercurial and fluid, like water. The only constant was its size. Ha! How about that? The shadow pouted, then reluctantly raised its thumbs. But how are you useful? He willed the shadow to strike the towel rack. It obediently moved and delivered a powerful kick. Of course, since it was just a shadow, its leg passed over the towels harmlessly, not even causing them to sway a little. Is that all you can do? In his mind, the image of shadow tentacles tearing the mighty tyrant into little pieces cracked and shattered mercilessly. It seemed he would not be competing with Shadow God anytime soon. How regretful. The shadow looked at him with disdain. Then it shrugged and stopped moving altogether, clearly offended. Sunny sighed and took a towel off the rack. All right. I will explore it later. A few minutes after that, he was wearing a clean police-issued tracksuit and heading for the cafeteria. Master Jet was waiting for him at one of the tables, with 2 trays full of steaming synthetic food in front of her. Help yourself. Sunny glanced at the cheap gruel, which was not so different from the stuff he used to consume in the outskirts, and sighed. Somehow, he had expected his first meal after becoming a sleeper to be more lavish. Still, it was food. He sat down and began to wolf down the gruel ravenously. He was very hungry. In the process, his thoughts began to wander. Sunny stole a glance at Jet and wondered. The spell told him to find a master, and the next thing he knew there was a woman calling herself master right in front of him. He tried to imagine being an obedient slave to someone like her. Weird thoughts started to appear in his mind. You know what, Sunny, he thought with dark irony. Knowing your luck, this would be a perfect moment for her to ask. What are you thinking about? Sunny choked on the gruel. He felt his mouth beginning to open, and put all of his will into staying silent. A second passed without him saying anything. Then a weird pressure appeared in his mind, which soon turned into blinding pain. He endured it for a couple more seconds before giving up. "I was thinking that it would be a perfect moment for you to ask me about what I am thinking," he finally said. Jet gave him a weird look. "All right. Are you almost finished with your food?" Sunny nodded. "Then I'll begin. As per protocol, I am obligated to inform you of a few things. It is mostly a formality. First of all, concerning your nightmare." She glanced at him and sighed. "You are entitled to receive free psychological counseling. No matter what traumatic experience you have encountered, there is no shame in asking for help. Your mind is as important as your body, it's only right to keep it healthy. Are you interested?" Sunny shook his head. Jet shrugged and continued. "As you wish. You can also talk to me." Was it very hard? How could he answer? It was simultaneously much worse than I expected and exactly as bad as I expected. She nodded, satisfied with that explanation. "That's a good attitude. I won't pry any further. Us outskirt rats are way more resilient than people think." Sunny looked at her in surprise. "Master Jet, you grew up in the outskirts?" She grinned. "What? You can't tell because of my exquisite manners and polished exterior?" He blinked a couple of times, surprised. "I couldn't tell at all." After thinking for a while, he added, "Are there a lot of people like us among the awakened?" Jet's smile disappeared. "No. There's not. In fact, they can be counted on one hand." As expected. Odds were really stacked against people like them. That made the 3 stars on Jet's insignia even more exceptional. "One day, I'll be a master too. If she can do it, why can't I? So, what happens now? What else are you obligated to tell me?" Sunny had no idea what he was supposed to do after leaving the police station. The winter solstice was just several weeks away. Jet leaned back and answered, "That's basically it. There are some additional hoops to jump through, mostly having to do with your family, but, well, I've read your file, so I know it doesn't apply. The only thing left is to decide how you will be preparing for your first journey into the dream realm." She looked at her communicator and grimaced. "I must say, your luck is exceptionally bad. There's not a lot of time at all. First of all, you are free to do what you want. No one is forcing you to make a certain decision. That is to say, you can choose to prepare on your own, or not prepare at all. Party until the lights go out." Sunny was not very well versed in partying. However, I would advise against that. As a sleeper, you are also entitled to enroll in the Awakened Academy. You'll be provided with food, lodging, and a wide choice of preparatory classes. This late into the year, you won't be able to learn a lot. But it's better than nothing. She was silent for a few seconds, then added. "More importantly, you will get acquainted with most of the people who will enter the dream realm with you. Some of them might become your companions for life. And some may end up trying to end that life once we're inside the spell," Sunny added, reading between the lines of what Master Jet had said. "So, what do you say? Do you want me to take you to the academy?" Sunny thought about it. Strangely, his flaw was silent, not forcing him to answer one way or the other. "Is it because I haven't made up my mind yet?" Finally, he looked down at his empty tray and made a decision. "Free lodging and food, you say?" "Yeah. I want to go to the academy." Chapter 19. Crossing the Bridge. Sunny was standing in front of the massive, seemingly indestructible red gates of the Awakened Academy. The academy was, in fact, a city within the city. It was built like a fortress, with a high wall made of hard alloy, deep moat and numerous large-caliber turrets which were placed in certain positions to create a deadly air suppression dome. No nightmare creature, not even colossal titans, were supposed to be able to break through its defenses. It was a legendary place. Actually, many of the most popular webtoons, youth dramas, and novels took place right behind that wall. Adventures, rivalries, and romantic entanglements of the young awakened heroes were the mainstream theme of modern entertainment. Never in his wildest dreams did Sunny imagine actually becoming one of these heroes. Of course, how things really were differed a lot from how it was portrayed in the media. More than that, he had only 4 weeks to spend here before venturing into the dream realm. Even if he wanted to, there was not enough time for any type of entanglement. And he definitely did not want to. He had to learn how to survive, not waste time on such nonsense. The snow was slowly falling to the ground. It was cold and silent in front of the academy gates. Except for Sunny, there was only one other person, another new sleeper, if he had to guess. It was a tall, slender girl of around his age, with clear gray eyes and a detached look on her face. She had strange, silver-white hair that was cut short and neatly parted to the side. Just like him, she was dressed in a police-issued tracksuit and had no personal belongings with her. On her head, there was a pair of old-fashioned headphones. She was calmly listening to music while they waited. There was a certain vibe to the silver-haired girl. It was sort of, as though she was apart from the world. She looked confident and self-sufficient, but also a bit lonely. Sunny wasn't going to start a conversation. Who knew what kind of situation he would put himself in due to that damn flaw? It was better to keep to himself. He glanced at the girl and sighed. I wonder what flaw does she have? Finally, the gates began to open. The giant, ridiculously thick sheet of reinforced metal slowly descended, creating a long bridge. Sunny looked ahead with grim determination. Master Jet's parting words echoed in his mind. On their drive to the academy, Sunny didn't speak much, looking at the sights of the city that were flying past the window of Jet's personal transport vehicle. Actually, it was his first time sitting in a PTV. Most people in the city couldn't even dream about getting a license and purchasing a vehicle like that, having to do with public transportation. He had ridden in the back of a police cruiser once or twice, but that was a completely different experience. At some point, Master Jet looked at him and said, "Since we both come from the outskirts, I'll give you 3 pieces of advice. Whether you listen to me or not is your business." Sunny turned his head, waiting. First, once you're registered in the academy, they'll offer you psychological counseling again. There will also be a valuable reward for sharing your experiences in the nightmare and the details of your appraisal. You'll be able to receive a soul shard, maybe even several of them. He frowned. Are you trying to convince me to visit a psychiatrist again? Jet shook her head. No. I'm telling you to refuse. Surprised, Sunny raised his eyebrows. Why? There was a pause before she answered. You're too green to understand, but out there in the dream realm, nightmare creatures are not the only danger. Once you grow powerful enough, humans will become an equal threat. The less they know about your aspect, the better. So that's how it is. The easiest way to defeat a powerful awakened is to use their flaw. That's why young fools in the academy are encouraged in various ways to share the details of their aspects. I'm not saying that the government will leak your information, but once 2 people know a secret, it's no longer a secret. And there's a lot of people working for the government. That made a lot of sense. Thank you, Master Jet. She gave him a nod. Second, there will be a lot of courses to choose from. All types of combat training, deep dives into nightmare creature categories and vulnerabilities, basics of various types of sorcery, artifact study, and so on. Sunny gulped. Actually, he was already agonizing about what weapon to train with. 4 weeks was not enough to master a weapon, but at least he would have a basic understanding of it. Disregard all of that. The only course you have time to attend is wilderness survival. He blinked. What? Jet glanced at him. It's different for city kids, who learn all sorts of useful things in school and from their tutors. But we don't have that advantage, do we? What was the biggest threat to your life during the nightmare? Sunny thought about it. On the surface, the most dangerous thing he faced was the tyrant, followed by Hero. Oro of the Nine. But actually, what almost killed him in the end was the cold. Jet smiled. Smart. You only know how to survive in the city. But the dream realm is mostly made of wilderness. Do you know how to make a fire? How to procure food? How to find safe shelter? No. Fighting monsters is important, but it'll be useless if you die of hunger or exposure to the elements. Trust me, I've learned it the hard way. Sunny nodded, angry at himself. It was so obvious, yet he never even thought about these seemingly simple things. He was blinded by his past habits and experience. Human brains were like that. Once accustomed to a certain way of living, it was hard to see past the already familiar routines. It was lazy thinking at its worst. At that point, Master Jet had stopped the car and opened the door, getting out. Sunny followed her and was momentarily stunned, staring at the colossal metal gates in front of them. This was the famous Awakened Academy. After a few seconds, he shook off his amazement and turned to his senior. "This is as far as I go," she said, looking cheerlessly at the walls of the academy. "I've already notified them. Someone will come fetch you in a while." There was something dark in the depths of her icy blue eyes. Sunny suddenly felt a cold feeling spreading through his body. "What's the third advice?" Master Jet glanced at him, then sighed. "Remember, no one can survive in the dream realm alone. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. Try to get along with your peers, even if they don't treat you well. It might save your life." Then she suddenly smiled and patted him on the shoulder. "You've done well to survive until now. Make sure to keep yourself alive in the future, too." Then she got back into her PTV and drove off. Just like that, she was gone. The end of the metal bridge hit the special grooves in the ground and stopped moving after a set of loud clicks. Sunny looked ahead, wondering what kind of life he was going to be living in the next 4 weeks. Keep your flaw and aspect secret, learn to survive in the wilderness. Be nice to other sleepers. It didn't sound too hard. But, for some reason, he was sure that these weeks were going to be as challenging as his first nightmare. Or maybe even worse. Seemingly free of such concerns, the silver-haired girl walked forward and stepped on the bridge. Sunny sighed and reluctantly followed. Chapter 20. Outcast once again. The sleeper part of the compound was relatively small and situated in the southern part of the academy, surrounded on all sides by training fields and parks. It was a low, modern building constructed with reinforced materials. Like the majority of buildings in the academy, most of it was hidden below the ground, leaving only a couple of floors above it. With its white, pristine alloy walls and wide windows, it must have looked beautiful in the summer, contrasted against all the greenery around. Inside, the building was spacious and well-lit. Sunny and the silver-haired girl were taken to a large hall where 100 or so of young men and women, sleepers of the same unfortunate timing as the two of them, were already waiting for the beginning of the induction ceremony. Most of them were nervous, tense and excited. Logistics of the academy were a constant headache for the administrators since the rate at which the spell-infected people was always chaotic. There was no way to orderly structure for batches of sleepers to undergo any type of standardized education on a shared schedule. Some of them had a full year to prepare for the dream realm, some only months, some even mere days. That's why these induction ceremonies were held each month at the beginning of the year and then every week once the winter solstice began to loom near. Some of the sleepers in the hall had to wait days to be inducted, while Sunny had lucked out and was delivered to the academy just hours before the scheduled event. Once inside the hall, he understood two things. Firstly, everyone was well dressed and in possession of a suitcase, a duffel bag, or at least a backpack carrying their personal belongings. They were obviously coming prepared, most likely from home, sent off by their families. So Sunny and the silver-haired girl, who came empty-handed and wearing simple police-issued clothes, were not a norm like he had assumed, but actually an eye-catching anomaly. Right. That makes sense. Secondly, Master Jet was not being overly humble when she called herself below average by Awakened standards. Even though these young people were just starting their paths as Awakened, their looks were dazzling. Everyone was handsome, beautiful, and radiated health. He swallowed. Still, I feel like none of them compare. She might not be as perfectly shaped, but I don't know, she has a presence. It's like shadows become deeper and the temperature drops by a couple of degrees when she's in a room. Was this the difference between a sleeper and a master? But all of these thoughts were just him trying to postpone the inevitable. Sunny already knew that he was in for a wild ride, because he could not lie, and all of these excited youths, regardless of their clothes, gender, and looks, wanted to do one thing. Talk. Every one of them wanted to talk with fellow sleepers. They wanted to discuss their nightmares, their future journey into the dream realm, and everything in between. They wanted to ask questions. They wanted to be asked questions. They wanted to discuss something important or just chit-chat about stupid things. Everyone wanted to share. It's a nightmare. Sunny moaned, disturbed and fearful. I'm doomed. Then, with a bit of grim determination, he gritted his teeth and slowly exhaled. Just think about it as a continuation of your trial. You survived the Black Mountain, so you can survive this, too. He had faced heroes, villains, monsters, and even gods. Was he going to be afraid of a bunch of teenagers? He might have underestimated how scary teenagers can be. In half an hour, pretty much everyone in the room hated his guts. After a short series of conversations, Sunny had acquired a reputation of an obnoxious, foul-mouthed pervert. This reputation was quickly solidified. He was slapped a few times and even punched once. He also discovered a couple of new things about his true self, namely, that deep down inside he was apparently rude, arrogant, and more than a little bit lustful. The conversations went something like this. Look at all these young people. How many do you think will return from the dream realm? How many will perish? What do you think our own chances of survival are? I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that a pompous fool like you will die first. Or, I even received an armor-type memory in my nightmare. It's an enchanted robe. Would you like to see? Actually, I would prefer to see you without a robe. Or, then those lowlifes began to rob the bodies. It was disgusting. They even took their shoes. What kind of degenerate would take a dead man's shoes? I once killed a man and took his boots. They were nice boots. What? You killed someone just for a pair of boots? Of course not. There were other reasons. I also took his cloak. Once again an outcast, Sunny was eventually left alone. People seemed to be avoiding him. Unperturbed, he found a quiet corner and stood there, glad that no one wanted to talk to him anymore. His face hurt, and there was blood dripping from his nose. Being ostracized from a group was nothing new, but it still stung. However, he was smiling. Because in the process of turning the whole batch of sleepers against himself, Sunny had discovered something vital. He learned how to control his flaw. Once asked a question, he could not keep quiet. He also couldn't lie. However, after a lot of experimentation, Sunny had found out that with a bit of practice, he could influence the exact way the truth eventually came out. It was like this: after receiving a question, his mind automatically produced a truthful answer. After that, the flaw would force him to say that answer aloud. Refusal to speak would result in the buildup of pressure, then piercing pain. The longer he kept quiet, the worse the pain would become. Eventually, he would have to surrender and reveal the truth. However, in these moments between receiving the question and surrendering to the pain, the actual wording of the answer could be changed. The more it strayed from the initial thought, the more resistance he would meet, once again in the form of pressure, then pain. It still had to be truthful, but it didn't have to be so stark. For example, if Master Jet were to catch him staring again and ask what he was looking at, instead of embarrassing himself, Sunny would have been able to endure a bit of pain and simply say, "You." That would still be the truth, however, the result would be entirely different. Hidden in the corner, Sunny grinned as he observed the sleepers. "This is good. This is great. This is something I can work with." After all, one didn't have to lie to deceive a person. Sometimes, truth was the best material for creating deceit. If used with a certain devious type of intelligence, truth could be as misleading as lies. For example, in one of his previous conversations, Sunny had confessed that he had once stolen boots from a dead man. The other guy was horrified and asked if he had really killed someone just for a pair of boots. The answer the flaw forced him to give was that there were other reasons and that he had also taken the man's cloak. The true reason for killing the veteran slaver was that he had whipped Sunny a few hours prior. Besides, he was already dying. The cloak had nothing to do with the killing itself. However, the wording of the answer created an impression that it did. Thus, two truthful statements, when put together, created an effect akin to a lie. This was just a simple example. With a lot of effort and intense thinking, Sunny could create other types of manipulative truths. It was going to be extremely difficult and risky, but it could be done. He just needed a bit of luck. It was time to put his theory to practice. Sunny didn't forget what his main goal was, to make sure that no one ever finds out his true name. To achieve that, he had to create an impression that he was the most pathetic, weak person in this whole building. Someone who would never receive a positive appraisal, let alone a divine aspect and a true name. However, since this would be a lie, he couldn't just go and say it. So how was he to convince everyone that he definitely did not have a powerful aspect and an impressive record with the spell? His eyes fell on a particular group of sleepers. There were 5 or 6 of them, gathered around a tall, confident young man. The young man had brown hair and a gentle, handsome face. His eyes were green, with a hint of friendly humor. His posture, figure and attentive gaze betrayed someone who went through extensive training. Everything about the young man screamed of nobility and strength. Just at that moment, one of his companions was saying with a tone of amazement, "Ascended? You have received an ascended aspect? What was your appraisal?" The young man smiled humbly. "Oh. It was excellent." Sunny stopped in front of the group, as though by accident. After hearing the young man's answer, he frowned and looked at him with disdain. Then, with a voice full of utter bewilderment, Sunny said, "Ascended, excellent? That's it? What's the big deal?"